When you hear the term Viking, what do you think of? Some imagine fearless warriors from the frozen north, but in reality, the Vikings are a lot more complicated. History tells us the Vikings were pirates, conquerors, traders, and mercenaries from all across Scandinavia. They also had some surprisingly progressive views for medieval society, and even practiced a form of democracy. Most importantly, for this video at least, they were explorers, and one of their discoveries almost changed the course of history. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovic, the alternate historian, and today we're going to talk about Vinland. For those who don't know, Vinland is a name given by the Vikings to a land they briefly settled in North America around 1000 AD. Although today we take it for granted that the Vikings beat Columbus to be the first Europeans to discover the Americas, for the longest time this was a fringe theory. Most of what we know about Vinland came from the Vinland sagas, aka the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. They told the story of Eric the Red, his kids, and their settlement of Greenland and Vinland. Quick side note, I know Viking is what you call a Scandinavian actively raiding and roving and not a real ethnic group, but since many people use the term to describe medieval Norse people, especially those who venture from their homes, I plan to do so as well to avoid being overly pedantic. So maybe go ahead and delete that comment you're about to write correcting me. Anywho, per the sagas, Eric the Red was an outlaw who was expelled from his home in Iceland after killing a man. Although it's debatable whether Eric was the first Norseman to discover Greenland, he does get credit for starting the first colony there, choosing to call it Greenland to encourage people to settle it in a pretty diabolical marketing trick. Although, to be fair, Greenland did have a milder climate back then, until the little ice age of the 1300s froze all their little Viking booties off. Later, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, would hear about land west of Greenland, and this inspired him to sail west, first discovering the rocky Helluland, which is believed to be our timeland's Baffin Island, then sighting the forested land of Markland, which is believed to be our timeland's Labrador, before finally establishing a base camp at what is believed to be Newfoundland, and due to the wild grapes that grew there, he called it Vinland. While there, the Vikings enjoyed abundant resources like salmon, and even described experiencing a winter without snow. Of course, the good times at Vinland didn't last. Relations with the local Native American tribes, which were fine at first, broke down when the natives asked for weapons and the Vikings refused to trade. It also didn't help that the Vikings called the Native Americans Skraelings, which translates as weakling, barbarian, or wretched people. It's like moving into a new neighborhood and immediately calling your neighbor a douchebag. I don't think you're going to be invited to that many barbecues. Ultimately, the Vikings decided to leave Vinland because they didn't feel like living in a place where they had to fight to stay. Thus, Norse America passed into legend, and because the sagas were only sort of reliable as historical records, no one really thought the Vikings discovered the New World until a Viking settlement was discovered at Lance Awe Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada in 1960, confirming the saga story of the Vikings in the Americas. What if the Vikings stayed in Vinland? What would happen if the Old World found out about the new 500 years earlier? First, we need to find our point of divergence, and for that I think we need to look at Jeffrey Winthrop Young's 2002 article, The Rise and Fall of Norse America, Vikings, Vinland, and Alternate History, where Jeffrey suggests that if Eric the Red, rather than Leif Erikson, had led the expedition to Vinland, the colony there may have survived longer. According to the sagas, Eric was supposed to do it, but he was injured after being thrown off his horse. Having Eric in charge of the Vinland settlement would give the colony a better shot at being successful. He was, after all, an experienced colonizer and a pretty good salesman. Thus, he probably could convince a large number of Vikings to colonize North America, which is important because in our timeline, early North American colonies were difficult to maintain, and a poorly managed one would not last for long. These colonies usually required a constant supply of settlers and good relations with the local Native Americans, whose numbers alone could easily wipe out any European settlement in its infancy, which would be even easier in the 11th century because the Vikings wouldn't have the advantages later Europeans had, like guns. Thus, a larger Norse colony at Vinland would have a better chance of surviving, especially if the local natives were hostile, which is probably a given. Then again, perhaps it would be even better for the first Norse colony in North America to be located somewhere else. I'm not sure who needs to be told this, but Newfoundland is pretty cold, and the further south the Norse could set up shop, the better. In fact, some have considered Lance Awe Meadows to be the Greenlanders' first stop on the road to Vinland, rather than the end of the line. This is in part because descriptions of places mentioned in the sagas don't always correspond with Lance Awe Meadows, and instead places like Boston and even New York City are brought up as possible alternatives for the main Viking settlement. These more southern locales would certainly have more resources and milder weather for a Norse colony. Just imagine a Viking colony on Manhattan, with longships sailing up the Hudson River. That sounds awesome. Unfortunately, no one has found any other Viking sites in North America, despite some promising locations that were studied farther south. Nevertheless, it's not ridiculous for a larger Viking settlement to be established in the St. Lawrence Valley, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, New England, or New York. A different location may also have a friendlier native tribe that could shrug off Viking rudeness in exchange for what they could offer them from the Old World. So now our Viking colony is under better management and in a more suitable location. So what happens next? Well, the biggest change is that Europeans would be aware of the New World almost 500 years earlier. Scandinavians might risk travel across the North Atlantic to settle there, giving Vinland the steady stream of colonists it would need to survive and grow. Eventually, news of this new land would spread throughout the rest of Europe and beyond. In fact, the Islamic world was in the midst of their golden age at the time, and thus would be well placed to stake a claim. Trade would soon blossom along the North Atlantic, meaning that the Columbian exchange, i.e. the transfer of crops, animals, technology, etc., between the New and Old Worlds would happen sooner. Although it would probably take time for it to have a major impact on the cultures involved, cargo capacity of ships heading to and from the New World will be small at first. However, necessity is the mother of invention after all. Thus, ship-building technology could advance faster than it did in our timeline, as Old Worlders built bigger ships to carry more cargo and people. Given time, some cultures may even experiment with a more southerly route rather than pass through Viking territory. I'm not sure what would happen to Greenland in this alternate timeline. In our timeline, the Little Ice Age made it near impossible for the Viking settlements to survive, and they were eventually abandoned. In this alternate timeline, the Greenlanders might flee to North America or perhaps stick it out on that frozen island thanks to a steady stream of supplies from the more prosperous Vinland and the charcoal trade they get from Europeans, treating the island as a rest stop before traveling further west. And how would this alternate colonization of the Americas change the cultural makeup of the Western Hemisphere? Well, hard to say without really knowing the major players involved, but we can make a few educated guesses. For example, in our timeline, Sweden did colonize North America, specifically the land around the Delaware River, which in our timeline includes parts of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. In this alternate timeline, however, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and perhaps even Finnish settlement would be even more widespread along the northeast coast of North America. What other unique features might Vinland have? Well, in Geoffrey Winthrop Young's The Rise and Fall of Norse America, he mentioned that many Vinland alternate histories feature timelines where Norse paganism is still practiced in the Americas. This isn't necessarily a crazy idea, as many Norse Greenlanders, like Eric the Red, were pagans. Plus, in our timeline, many British North American colonies acted as sanctuaries for religious minorities, such as Massachusetts for the Puritans, Pennsylvania for the Quakers, and Maryland for the Catholics. Thus, it's not implausible to think that Vinland in this alternate timeline could serve the same purpose. That said, my guess is this wouldn't last forever, as waves of Christian migrants would overwhelm the original pagan settlers, but it's still possible some pagan communities might exist to the present. Would Norse domination of North America last forever? Probably not. In our timeline, the Americas were initially divided between the Spanish and Portuguese, but obviously the English, French, Dutch, and Russians ignored that. Wars and politics back in Europe and the Americas would probably change the political map over time, but it's possible some Norse states might survive, while the rest of the continent goes to other states. And let's not forget about the Native Americans, who might get stuck with the name Skraelings in this alternate timeline. They would be exposed to Old World diseases earlier, and while the death toll would still be bad, they would have more time to gain immunity to these diseases and build up their numbers before shipbuilding technology progressed enough to bring in larger waves of European settlers. Thus, the native tribes would be in a better position to fend off European colonizers. Cahokia, for example, would be at the height of its power when the Vikings would be settling the northeast coast of the Americas. If they can weather the Old World diseases, perhaps the mound builders of the Mississippi could prove an effective deterrent against Old World expansion into the Midwest. Ultimately, North America might start looking a lot like this map that I had commissioned from Sean McKnight. After a couple centuries, we could see the Norse settlements in the northeast, with native states sandwiched between them, and perhaps another Old World power like the Almohads. To be fair, it's just one possibility out of many, but you have your own ideas of what could happen if the Viking colony of Vinland was permanent? Share it in the comments. So, final thoughts? Stories about an alternate Vinland remain rather popular in our favorite genre, and I think it's in part because of how big of a missed opportunity it was. The Vikings literally discovered the other half of the planet, and yet did nothing with it. Sure, it would cost an inconceivable amount of treasure and blood to keep Vinland from being lost to history, but if anyone can accomplish such a feat, it would have to have been the legendary Vikings, if they only got a couple lucky breaks. Nevertheless, the New World proved too much for the Norse, but it still makes for some fun speculation, and I hope my foray into it was to your liking. Before I leave you, quick shout out to Noah of the History of Vikings podcast. It was talking with Noah that inspired me to make this video, and his podcast was a great resource for my research, especially his episode on the Vinland sagas with Siobhan Clarke, author of The Children of Midgard. I will put links for Noah's stuff in the description below so you can check it out. Well, that is all to say on the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.